One of the main thoughts that one hears when one begins to turn the mind toward Dharma is the idea of impermanence. Now, when we hear that all things are impermanent, we take this in a very, well, we take it just as it sounds. We know from our own experience that all things are impermanent, or at least we know that roughly. We know that if we buy ourselves a quart of milk, that the quart of milk will either sour or be used up. We know that if we buy a car or a color TV or something like that, that eventually the car or the color TV will break down and then we'll have to buy another one and go through the entire process. We also know that what is young becomes old, much to our dismay, and no matter what we do only works temporarily. What was young becomes old. We also learned that what is high will become low. What is low will become high. What is brought together will separate. What is separate will be brought together again. But this is the one aspect of the idea of impermanence that we don't really hold to. We don't really understand very well. We try to have a more superficial view of impermanence because the idea is painful. It's not our favorite concept. When the Buddha taught us about impermanence, he taught us about impermanence as a way to understand the faults of samsara and as a way to understand how suffering is all-pervasive. Again, as human beings, we like to ignore the idea of suffering. Of course, when we are suffering and we can feel it very deeply, it's pretty hard to ignore. But we know that when we are feeling pretty good and feeling pretty comfortable, the idea of suffering becomes sort of distant and cloudy. And when we feel up, we feel, in a way, we have mixed feelings. We feel as though it's always going to be this way and life is pretty good. But then, by the same token, we're afraid to feel too up because we know if we feel too up, we're going to have too far to fall. It's odd. We have this neurotic capacity for seeing the truth and yet using it against ourselves or hiding it from ourselves. It's like we know, but we close our eyes because we don't want to know. And so this particular suffering of samsara becomes to us somewhat hidden, and actually the hiding of this particular truth leads us to many disappointments. For instance, in the case of, let's say, meeting someone that you love very much, meeting a loved one, and coming together with that loved one in some capacity, perhaps if it is a romantic relationship, then coming together in marriage or something of that nature. If it is the coming together of a parent and child, such as in the birth of a child, then the parent sees the child and the child sees the parent, and the parent, being the elder, has the capacity to perhaps recognize something very familiar about that child, or feel that this isn't a new acquaintance, that somehow there is a deep and profound connection here with this child. And sometimes people will meet each other in a very casual way and will become instant allies and best friends. I know that's happened to each one of us at some point in our lives. It certainly has happened to me, where you would meet someone and suddenly this person becomes your ally, your friend, someone who is really a helper to you and who understands, and it feels as though you've been friends for a very long time. So in each of these cases, when we have these wonderful meetings that bring us so much joy, at that point we like very much to forget that that joy is impermanent. And yet, everything we know and everything we've seen teaches us and leads us to believe that everything is impermanent. We have seen that in the cases of romantic relationships that even result in marriage, and should that marriage go really well, then ultimately still the marriage will be separated. The bond will be separated through death. And we know that in the case of parent and child, no matter how close the parent and child are when they're younger, the relationship will evolve and change, and in some cases the relationship becomes very distant, unfortunately. In other cases where that does not occur, then even when the relationship between parent and child stays loving and has mutual concern in it, then still eventually one will leave the other. There will be the separation of death. The separation of death always happens. And even within that experience of togetherness, there is so much change that literally you can say the two people that married, say, in their 20s are not the same people that are together in their 60s and 70s. They look completely different. If you know what the difference is between, say, a 25-year-old and, say, a 60-year-old, there are worlds of difference. There is a vast amount of experiential living and maturity that has occurred. And that person at 20 is quite different when they reach 60. It's very different. I mean, I remember for myself being in my 20s and where I was and where I wasn't. And now, although gratefully I'm not yet 60, but it's around the corner, here I am at 13 days away from 47. Oy. And I know that I am not the same 20-year-old that I was. I know that many of my understandings, beliefs, habits, even values have matured and changed. And so it is impossible to think that we remain in the same comfortable, stagnant condition for even the rest of our lives, let alone the fact that we are all separated by death. So as I was saying, literally the people that are together at 20 are different people when they are together at 60. Then if you think about even the food that we eat, we think, oh, well, once you've eaten the food, well, it's part of you and it's nourishing. You forgot the rest of the story. Don't you remember what happens to food after a few hours? Food changes when you eat big chocolate cake. Well, what would you like to eat? Let's say, what are we having today? I would like to have chocolate mousse. How about that? So I'm going to eat my chocolate mousse, and yum, 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 it's so good, and you think, oh, this chocolate mousse is really spectacular. I don't have to share it with anybody. There's nobody in the room, and I can eat the whole mousse myself. Well, chocolate mousse. I can eat the whole chocolate mousse myself, and don't have to share it with anybody. I can even, nobody's else, I can really lick that. You know, I can really enjoy this. And I don't have to give it away. And once I eat it, it is mine. No one can demand it back. Except that it seems to, after a few hours, exit the body. And before it does so, it creates some minor distresses on the way down. But anyway, even that delicious experience, that experience with one's food, and even assuming the food were not chocolate mousse and in fact something nourishing, while you might receive benefit and energy from good, nutritious food, ultimately the experience of eating is impermanent. And even the condition of taking in nourishment is impermanent, because after having taken in nourishment, then even the most delicious food results in waste. And what is good of the food results in the use, we use that to make energy, and the energy is expended. So everything that we know and understand in our life experience is changing. You are not the same person that you were 7 years ago. Everything about you has changed. Literally, the cells in your body have changed and been reborn with very few exceptions. There are some cells in the human body that do not change that quickly. But the majority of cells change every 7 years. It's quite remarkable. And it's really interesting to wonder, to ask ourselves, why is it then that we maintain like physical scars from when we're younger? Isn't that odd? I mean, if we constantly create new cells and they're changed every 7 years, what's that doing there? I fell on a piece of glass and wire when I was a little girl, playing in a vacant lot, and cut my arm right over there. Why is that still there? I was a little girl when it happened. I've changed many times over. And it's because we do not understand impermanence. Our consciousness sees everything as being solid. And it's so odd, isn't it? Because 7 years ago, we were something completely different. If you think about what you looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Don't take my word for it. Bring out the pictures. You look completely different. I look completely different. I'm sure you do also. And so even though we have a sense of self-nature being inherently real and solid and very permanent, still we are this very impermanent condition that only thinks of itself in a certain regard. But when we first meet with the path, we are taught that all things are permanent, and we are led to a study of that. And the study should look like this. We understand in this way. When we are born drawing on the karma of our previous existences. And that scenario is catalyzed by the environment around us. Whatever karmic potentials are within our mind stream are then ripened and matured and brought forward due to certain catalytical events in our environment. And then beyond that, we continue to habituate ourselves. We have certain propensities due to our karmic flavor, if you will. These certain propensities look like habitual tendencies, and they are, in fact, habitual tendencies. One person may have a great habit toward generosity and may look for ways to engineer their life going on the track of generosity, compassion. Another person may have the habit of self-absorption and anger, regarding only one's own feelings, not taking into account the feelings of others in the environment, being very self-absorbed and wishing that others would help oneself, would be of benefit to oneself. And so that kind of selfishness becomes then a deep habit and very difficult to break. So another person may have that kind of habit. Unfortunately, there are sentient beings with many different kinds of karma. One may have had the habit pattern through many lifetimes of creating this habitual tendency of harming others or hurting others or killing others. And actually, the kinds of animals that are by their type predators are actually beings who have within them the habitual tendency of killing, and they manifest as predators due to that habitual tendency. So we come in with certain kinds of habits, and then we tend to reinforce them throughout the course of our lives. And yet, according to this teaching that the Buddha has given us about impermanence, we understand that there is nothing, not one thing, that we can accomplish or accumulate during the course of our lifetimes that we can take with us at the time of our death. Meaning this, let's say that we accumulate a great deal of money. Let's say that, let's say in the past we have been very generous to others, and so we have the karma of being able to manifest money fairly easily. Many people do. It's that simple. It's due to having been generous in the past. This element of money coming into one's life is like grease lightning. It just really comes in very easily. So if that's the case, then let's say during this lifetime we spend a great deal of time making a lot of money. And yet, even though we have the habit of being very generous in the past, somehow the impact of things working out the way they do in this lifetime and really the shock of receiving so much money, it reminds me of the story that, what is that man's name, who is making lots of money with computers these days? He's came from nowhere. Right, Mr. Computer Geek. Really that was kind of where he was at, and then suddenly he's a multi-billionaire. And it seems from everything I've read about him that he is shocked. And he just doesn't get it. It's just, to have several $1 billion that you can get your hands on if you really need to, and then to think that you need to make more before you can be generous is really an unusual way to think, wouldn't you think? How many billion can you spend in one lifetime? So anyway, for somebody like that, obviously he was very kind and generous in the past, but here he has been hit with this amazing shock of things just simply ending up being where money has just flown into his pocket. And now he is in danger of making the mistake of spending his energy and his opportunity increasing that money without increasing the generosity. And therefore, in the future, he will not have the same result. because none of that money that he's making now is going to go with him. This is the Buddha's teaching, that we cannot take even one sesame seed's worth of our accumulated wealth with us when we go into the bardo. But according to the Buddha's teachings also, supposing we were to make the choice of being extraordinarily generous and using our wherewithal, our wealth, to make the world a better place, to benefit others, to support others who are in need, that sort of thing, then we can take this habitual tendency of generosity, this karmic potential, by virtue of the fact that we have given so much to others and been so kind and generous, that karmic potential, that habitual tendency does go with us into the next life. Because it isn't measurable like a sesame seed. It is the karma of one's mind stream. It is the habitual tendency of our consciousness. And so that does go into the next life. And these are the Buddhist teachings, that we actually have the opportunity to create benefit in this life that does last into the next life. But it's nothing material, nothing that we can ever create in samsara that will go with us. Nothing that has weight, size, dimension. Nothing we can hold, nothing material. Only the habits of our mind. So these are the teachings that we receive when we first come to Dharma. Now, what has this got to do with compassion? Obviously, if you create the habit of compassion and generosity, then that habitual tendency will stay with you. And in some future life, it will affect your rebirth and your circumstances. There will be much more joy and happiness. So this is true, and this is one way to look at it. But when one engages truly on the Bodhisattva's path, one goes beyond that superficial kind of view. One goes much deeper into the understanding of how to live one's life. And so one's morals and ethics and values are developed because of this Bodhisattva ideal. The Bodhisattva understands these teachings that the Buddha has taught, that all things are impermanent. The Bodhisattva understands that whatever material gain we can amass during the course of this life can only bring temporary happiness, and ultimately, if it's all we do, it will bring suffering. So this is the Bodhisattva's studying, and the Bodhisattva comes to the point of realizing that. But then there is another kind of amazing logic that enters into the mind of the Bodhisattva and becomes part of our life experience and becomes the most profound law that we can live by. And that is this. If we think about this body of ours, this body that we cherish and hold on to, we decorate it, we love it, we keep it safe, we make sure that it's happy. We revolve much of our time and our effort around this body and its upkeep. And then we think about this ego that is our mind and our consciousness, our awareness of self, but even beyond that, the extended effort to maintain ego is part of the egocentric structure that we call me. Our own habits and patterns that we have developed over time in order to avoid the chaos of the idea that what we are as egocentric beings might change in any way, shape, manner, or form. The amazing effort that we put into perpetuating ourselves and our needs, into reacting with either hope or fear towards every other thing, so that we can determine whether we want it or we want to move away from it. The kind of self-cherishing that requires us to think of our own well-being and to look at other sentient beings as objects from which we can get what we need, like love, approval, romance, money, power, anything. These kinds of ideas and habits, the Bodhisattva realizes are futile. And the reason why is this. during the course of our lives, we spend much of our time amassing, structuring, creating support for ourselves, for our ego in some way. Because we fear annihilation. Once you have the belief in self-nature as being inherently real, that self has to be supported and continued. Because the idea is that if self-nature were to dismantle or not be the same, that somehow chaos would result. We have no knowledge of our true nature as being the primordial Buddha ground of being, that primordial wisdom nature that is our true nature. We rely on this idea of self-nature as being that which must be perpetuated. So the Bodhisattva understands, however, that everything that we amass during the time of our lives, everything that we strengthen around us, all of the protection that we build, the superstructuring that we do when we meet up with other than self-nature and we react with hope and fear and begin to do the dance of self-protection and of self-establishment. The entire structure of self and its relationship to other, the entire idea, the Bodhisattva knows that eventually this will come to nothing. The Bodhisattva has been trained, and this is not a feeling response. This is an intellectual response due to training. And the Bodhisattva is trained to understand that no matter what we accumulate and what we gather together during the course of our lives, by the time of the end of our life, none of that will have any meaning. At the end of our lives, we experience the winding down of all of our energies. And as we die, even the physical, psychological, emotional constituents, particularly the physical elements, one by one, all begin to dissolve. The fire element within our body begins to dissolve. The body cools. The water element within the body begins to dissolve and break down. The body becomes drier. As we approach death, the mouth, the mucous tissues within the body become drier and drier. The earth elements within the body, they all dissolve. The body itself begins to break down. And even the wind element within the body begins to dissolve. Mental process begins to slow. And one's activity level also begins to slow at the end of one's life. Then at the time of death, all of the constituents actually break down and separate. And so as the consciousness abandons the body and the body becomes simply a heap of broken down constituents, what remains, the consciousness, that which has its habitual tendency fully established, is not able to take with it any of the real or material objects that it has gathered in its great drama during the course of its life. And so all that remains is the consciousness that held, in a sense, as a basket, held these material things, these solid, impermanent realities associated with that particular life. The consciousness, however, remains, and if the consciousness spent most of its lifetime in establishing material wealth or gathering substance to support the ego, then the consciousness has only that habit of supporting the ego to take with it at the time of death. Only that habit. On the other hand, if a life of generosity and caring has taken place, then that moves as consciousness into the next rebirth. That habit moves as consciousness into the next rebirth. Now the Bodhisattva knows this, and so the Bodhisattva's prayer then is based not on a feel-good emotion of, gee, I'd like to be a really cool person, be so kind and so neat and so terrific that everybody loves me and calls me saint somebody. That's not what the Bodhisattva thinks. The Bodhisattva thinks instead in a very logical and precise way, according to the Buddha's teachings, that if everything will dissolve, if all the efforts of my life to gather will come to nothing, if all the efforts of my life to keep for myself and build up my treasure house of material goods will ultimately come to nothing, if all of my efforts to preserve my power will ultimately come to nothing, because power dissolves at the time of death also, but the habit of grasping at power is reborn as consciousness. So if gathering power will come to nothing, if gathering wealth will come to nothing, if preserving myself in this extraordinary way and thinking only in a self-cherishing and egocentric way will ultimately come to nothing other than suffering in the next rebirth, why not give everything now? So the posture of a bodhisattva is misunderstood in our culture. It is thought that, when a parent raises a child, the parent does not say to the child, "What I'd really like you to do, darling, is to be a great, generous mystic. I want you to be so generous that you give your life up for others. I want you to be so generous that you pay no attention to your own welfare or comfort, but instead, I would like you to live and die for the benefit of sentient beings." Nobody's mother told them that. What our parents tell us is, and they are not at fault, it's due to the culture that we are raised in. What we are told by our parents and their parents before them and everything around us is that there are certain things that one must do in order to be successful. One must gain recognition, power, money, ease of living. These are the things that one must do. But when one enters onto the path and becomes a bodhisattva, one is faced with an entirely new set of ethics and morals and responsibilities. But this entire process must be understood as an intelligent, logical, and reasonable process, simply by virtue of the fact that no matter what we accomplish during the course of this lifetime, other than the impact it has on our own bouquet of habitual tendencies, there is not one piece of what we collect that we can take with us. Not one thing. So here is the Bodhisattva's intelligence, and it is an intelligence. It is based on truth. It is based on fact. It is something like the intelligence of a person who receives a great deal of money, let's say, or something precious. And if they've never had that before, if they haven't thought it through, they might say, "Oh, now I've got $10,000 here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend that money and have a really good time. I've never had $10,000 before, so I'm just going to go spend it, and I'm going to get all the things that I wanted to get. I'm going to get some of my bills paid up, and I'm going to get a down payment on a car, and I've got some clothes that I have in mind, and all these different things that I'm going to maybe buy a new TV, and I've got all this laid out for me." It's a sentient being's normal reaction to having blessings in their life or to life itself is a little bit like that. I've got this thing, how am I going to spend it? The Bodhisattva thinks very differently. The Bodhisattva realizes, according to the Buddhist teaching, that life is like a precious jewel when one meets with Dharma, meets with the teacher, and meets with the method by which we can accomplish realization. So this life is understood as wealth, for sure. We understand that there is a tremendous gift here. But how is the gift utilized? There comes in a completely different kind of logic. The Bodhisattva realizes that in the end, all will come to nothing if our only gain is on the material realm. That in the end, all of the effort that we put into self-cherishing and beautifying ourselves and the ease of our lives and the comfort of our lives and the accomplishment on the mental and physical levels of our lives, even those greatly cherished social institutions like vast education, even that will come to nothing, other than perhaps the discipline of studying. That habit may be brought into the next rebirth. But everything that we have learned to love and cherish will come to nothing. And so the Bodhisattva thinks, therefore, if in samsara all efforts come to nothing, if all that survives is one's virtue or lack of virtue, if all that matters in samsara eventually breaks down, then why should I put much effort into these things? Why should these things be precious to me? Because ultimately they will be lost. They will come to nothing. The Bodhisattva then thinks more like a smart investor. You want to invest in that which brings ultimate return. Kindness, generosity, spiritual habits, habits associated towards traveling on the path of Dharma and developing oneself spiritually, making offerings, living with generosity, meditating, praying, contemplating, teaching. These virtuous acts, these are the things that will bring a kind of result that one can carry over into the next life. So the Bodhisattva is not so much a martyr as they are someone who has been trained through logic and reason to understand not to put all of one's emphasis and hopes in that which will ultimately disappoint. The Bodhisattva has been trained well enough to know that ultimately all things in samsara are disappointing. And so the Bodhisattva then makes a choice, and that choice is based on training. That choice is to put one's emphasis and one's effort only in those things which will produce the excellent result of enlightenment and benefit to others. This is how the Bodhisattva thinks. And so we are at that point on our spiritual quest and our spiritual path when we come to make that decision in a firm and true way. Now, when we first meet with the path of Buddhism, immediately we are given the opportunity to take the precious vow of refuge and bodhicitta. So many of you have already taken that vow. For those of you that have, you must understand that at every opportunity, there is still the option to study further the Buddha's teachings and to understand the logic and reasonableness of living the life of a bodhisattva. And you should do that, because after one has taken the bodhisattva vow, even if one has taken it with complete and total absorption to the best of one's ability, there is still more. There is still more that one can do regarding the depth of that vow. And so as a bodhisattva, we constantly spend our effort, rather than in gathering material goods, we spend our effort, therefore, in creating for ourselves this life understanding, this life effort, this life project of constantly reviewing the condition of samsara and seeing its pitfalls and its impermanence and transforming everything that we have, all of our gifts, into that which can benefit sentient beings. Because this habit, this project, this goal, this accomplishment is something that one can take into one's next rebirth. It is the habitual pattern kind of scenario that one will take into one's next rebirth as consciousness. So the Bodhisattva then thinks, and meditates constantly on which things are worth putting effort into and which things are not. Now, the Buddha also taught about the middle way. The Buddha tried at first, when he realized the suffering of sentient beings, he tried at first the life of the ascetic. And he tried even to sit with those who engaged in the kind of meditation that was based on self-mutilation and a kind of meditation that was very strict and very severe. He meditated with yogis who would mutilate their bodies in order to overcome pain and renounce the attraction to comfort. Excuse me, I've been talking a lot lately. So, the Buddha tried that, and the Buddha sat with them. And these yogis did not eat or sleep comfortably. They meditated constantly. They remained in this one little grove, and they ate very little. They might live on bits of plant and even bits of mushroom that grow on the ground, and if someone gave them something to eat, they might eat on that, but they had no determination about wanting a certain kind of food. Whatever they found that day, that's what they ate. There was no dependence on comfort for their happiness and well-being. So Lord Buddha practiced with them for a while, and eventually he gave up on that method. He gave up on that method because he saw that there is a kind of limitation to that focus. That particular focus was sort of a dead-end street. So it can result even in a kind of poison or a kind of pridefulness, where the yogi is more concerned with their strict discipline, and it becomes something of an obsession. You know, it becomes something of a medal of honor that one wears. Then they are the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings. And so Lord Buddha found that kind of rigidity and that kind of narrow view somewhat distasteful. And so Lord Buddha went on to the middle way. Therefore, as a bodhisattva, we are not being asked to never have a moment of comfort. No one's asking you to pierce your tongue or do any of those things those funny yogis did. No one's asking you to sit on a bed of nails and sleep on a bed of nails. No one's asking you to hang out in a grove and not have a house, not keep warm in the wintertime. No one's saying that you have to wear the same robes until they rot off of your body. Lord Buddha does not teach that as a method. Lord Buddha teaches instead that all sentient beings are suffering, that we are suffering due to desire, that there is an end to suffering, and that end to suffering can be practiced as the Eightfold Path, which we in our tradition condense into the practice of wisdom, or the realization of emptiness, and compassion, or the bodhicitta. These are the two legs of the path. And this is the moderate middle way that Lord Buddha taught. So as a bodhisattva, you are not being asked to never be happy. One's own happiness, both temporary and ultimate, and the happiness of others, becomes instead inseparable, non-dual. One would not honor oneself and cling to ego, because that would be a nonsensical thing to do. There is no good result from that. The Bodhisattva realizes that. The Bodhisattva, however, would not make oneself suffer purposefully or hurt oneself in some way, because there is really no point to that. The point of practicing the path is the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings, and you're one of them. So in the view of the Bodhisattva instead, we realize that everything in life is impermanent, that nothing we can gather has any meaning other than the collection of virtuous habitual tendencies within our mind stream. And that, having realized that, one travels a moderate path in which one's own enlightenment and the enlightenment of others become the same weight and non-dual. Further, further, we come to understand that we are one and others are many. So even in this room, let's say, if I am practicing as a Bodhisattva, I think that, yes, my happiness is equal to the happiness of any one of you, but there are so many more of you than there are of me that it only makes sense for me to do what is beneficial for you rather than what is beneficial for me. This I live by. I try my best to live by. And as a Bodhisattva, I consider this to be the most precious understanding that I have. It's my treasure and my wealth. And it's reasonable and logical that the needs of the many would outweigh the needs of the one. Because we are the same, and because we all wish to be happy, and because in our nature we are absolutely inseparable and indistinguishable from one another. So I find that I cannot be happy without you. And so all of the different gatherings and collections that one can make during the course of one's lifetime have to be understood in that way. Are they really worth anything? Or are they the gaudy, childlike baubles that we play with until we have a better understanding of what the Buddha has taught? When we mature as spiritual beings, our tendency is to put aside such objects, these little baubles that we toy with. And then the Bodhisattva attains a kind of maturity and happiness that is different from what perhaps other sentient beings maintain. Other sentient beings revolve in this kind of episodic, cyclic continuum of you've got this and now you feel this way in a reactive way, and then you lose it, and now you have this and you feel this way in a reactive way, and then you lose it. And we go up and down and up and down and kind of ride this current of samsaric experiences in the same way that a little child simply plays with everything around them. You know how little children, when they're small enough, the world is their toy. And they just want what they want, whatever attracts their eye. They want that and they have it, and they don't understand what that wanting is or where it's going to result. As sentient beings who have not been matured into the bodhicitta, we live the same way. But when we mature as spiritual beings, we begin, sort of like spiritual adults, to see the, the impermanent quality of everything around us, the compulsive, addictive, never-ending, fruitless, useless experience of just having this and having that and feeling this and riding on this current of acquisition and power and self-pleasing. We realize that this kind of thing is kind of fruitless, in the same way that after a while as adults we grow up and we don't want to play with blocks anymore. We don't want to color anymore. We don't want to do those things. We don't want to explore the world and put everything in our mouths to see what it tastes like and drop everything from our high chairs. We don't want to do that. We're on to bigger and better things, you know? So as spiritual adults, now we feel like we have something else that we need to do. We have a plan, we have goals, we have a long-range view. And that's the spiritual maturing process that each one of us must go through. Now, how do you go through that? Again, this is something that I've been trying to stress. A child will never grow up if conditions surrounding the child do not grow them up. Why would a child grow up? Why would you stop going to Toys R Us? There's all kinds of fun things there. A child will simply not grow up in that fashion. Naturally, if they were living in kind of a if you can imagine a bubble that does not challenge them in any way. But children do grow up into adults, and they do so because as they move through time, or as they believe they move through time, they meet with greater and greater challenges. And each experience of meeting with that challenge matures that person into an adult. And it is the sum total of their experience that is their actual adulthood. It's the same way with a spiritual being as they move into the path of practice. As children, we are only interested in taking care of ourselves. We are only interested in getting what we want. Well, we didn't actually even understand taking care of ourselves, because really, if we understood taking care of ourselves, we would mature. But as children, we just delight in everything, and we want everything, and it's give me this, give me this, give me this. I need this new piece of equipment. I need this new piece of clothing. I need this new gizmo. I have to have this car, and I'm just gathering all of this, you see. And as spiritually matured people, we realize that through experience, and it's experience that teaches us, that after we've gathered a few of these things, we still aren't happy. We are still neurotic. In fact, we find that the more we gather to please ourselves without consideration for cause and effect relationships, or without considering whether or not this is of any true value within our lives, we find that we are disappointed and disappointed and disappointed, and it continues and it never ends, the level of disappointment. Every time we try to get something for ourselves that makes us feel better without any thought for cause and effect relationships, it's just the oddest thing. It's like we have this little, I don't know, kind of heartbreak with this disappointment. Every time we try to make ourselves happy and it doesn't work, there's this part of us somewhere inside that goes, oh, wow, I really thought that was going to work. How come that didn't work? And we're confused and lost. But as spiritually mature people, we begin to learn in the same way adults learn that children's toys aren't much fun anymore. And as spiritually mature people, we begin to understand that what we have to do now is to live a life that has more meaning than that. To live a life where we can plot out and plan and understand the result. So these are the thoughts that a bodhisattva comes to. When we first enter onto the bodhisattva path, we're thinking that maybe we are doing this because we've always wanted to be a good person. And we have all kinds of mixed motivation. Maybe we never got enough approval when we grew up. Maybe Mama was always telling us that we were never going to amount to very much, or something like that. Maybe Dad was always telling us that we have to live our lives in a certain way in order to meet with his approval. Maybe our society has taught us that if we don't attain certain things, we are a ne'er-do-well. For whatever reason, when we first meet with the bodhisattva path, we think that we are going to make of ourselves something good. We are going to approve of ourselves, finally. We are going to be good people. We fall in love with the romance of being saintly. But ultimately, the life of a bodhisattva has not one thing to do with that. Nothing to do with that. The purpose, the intention, the planning of a bodhisattva is not according to that. The planning of the bodhisattva is based on logic and reason. And since we have met with the idea of the bodhisattva, and many of us have already taken the bodhisattva vow, or perhaps are planning to take the bodhisattva vow, this is the time for the beginning student or the student who has been a practitioner for some while to really determine for oneself what the true meaning of the bodhisattva ideal actually is. To see the reasonableness of it, to see the logic of it, to understand that to do anything else is to walk through one's life as a child, mindlessly, just grabbing and playing and having la-la land in your head. But that the life of a spiritually mature bodhisattva is a life of understanding, a life of clarity, a life of reasonableness, a life in which that spiritual participant thinks in full equations, which ordinary sentient beings simply do not do. Now, having learned what results in happiness, these virtuous patterns, these virtuous habits, these virtuous actions, that this is what results in happiness, and not grabbing in an egocentric way. Now, understanding that, the spiritually mature Bodhisattva begins to plan. And begins to understand also that according to the Buddha's teachings, all sentient beings are in that same condition of revolving hopelessly in samsara, not understanding what are the components of happiness and what brings relief from suffering, not understanding as well what intensifies suffering and makes it much worse. Sentient beings literally are revolving in samsara helplessly, like bees flying around in a jar, not understanding how to get out, just bumping, bumping, bumping on all the sides. Having looked at that, having looked at the suffering of the world, having seen that everywhere in the world, in places all over the world, there is hunger, there is war, there is disease, old age, sickness, and death, constantly claim even those on the human realm, where there is less suffering than in many of the other realms. And on the unseen realms, we are taught that according to the Buddha, all sentient beings are suffering horribly, and they have no understanding, really, of what makes the cessation of suffering. Having met with the path and understood all these things, and then understanding as well the Buddha's teaching, then we make an intelligent choice. I and all sentient beings have been wandering helplessly and hopelessly in samsara, not understanding the cause of my suffering, not understanding the cause of the suffering of others, not understanding the causes of happiness for myself and others. Now I have come to this place of choice, intelligence, clarity, and responsibility. And therefore, having seen the truth and understanding that there is an end to suffering, I will practice for the sake of sentient beings. This is the choice that the spiritually mature Bodhisattva brings, to practice temporarily by bringing happiness and relief to those that they can in any way possible, and then to practice ultimate or extraordinary bodhicitta, which is to bring the ultimate happiness, the ultimate joy of the revelation of the path to others, so that they too might attain ultimate happiness. To give others the method by which they can end their suffering, and the method by which they can gain happiness. The method of clarity that teaches us that virtuous seeds bring virtuous and joyful results, where non-virtuous seeds bring non-virtuous and negative results. Understanding that I myself will be a guide and a light to benefit others through their confusion. And the prayer of the Bodhisattva is that we would live and exist as a Bodhisattva long enough to be the one to watch the very last of them cross over through the doors of liberation into freedom. And that is my prayer, and that should be the prayer of each and every one of us, that we would be the last and would be able to see every single sentient being cross the ocean of suffering into freedom. Again, are you such a nice guy when you do this, that you should be exalted? Well, yes, the Bodhisattva should be exalted because the Bodhisattva is our hope. The Bodhisattva appears in the world for the safety and benefit of sentient beings. But actually, if you think about it, the Bodhisattva is only growing in wisdom and understanding to the degree that they know that I have no freedom. As a Bodhisattva, I have no freedom without you. I cannot be without you. That primordial ground of being, that nature that is Buddha, that primordial wisdom state that is our true nature, is inseparable, indistinguishable. There is literally no place that I end and you begin. To say that we are one is not enough. To say that what we are is suchness. The ground of being, the great emptiness from which all phenomenal reality arises. And so literally for me to take my little piece of happiness and try to go into the corner and reinforce myself and make myself gratified in every way and to forget about you is something like a cosmic neuroses. Because it is inappropriate activity based on confused information, just the way neuroses is. And it actually goes to increase neuroses on a mental level. That one who thinks in that way, in that selfish, self-absorbed way, honoring only oneself to the exclusion of others, only increases their neuroses and becomes progressively less and less happy. So this is the truth that we discover, and it is based on reasonableness and logic. And in a way, in a better world, these are the things that our mom and dad should have told us as we grow up. This should be understood as the pinnacle of attainment for any human being. But they were misinformed also. Now we rely on our teachers to be our spiritual parents, and we rely on the Buddha's teaching to be that which leads us to the door of liberation with clear thought, clear-mindedness. Is the Bodhisattva, therefore, with all of this information, unafraid? Heck no. The Bodhisattva is afraid just like anyone else. Why not? Nobody wants to be challenged. Nobody wants to have difficulty or obstacles. Nobody wants to suffer. The Bodhisattva is not less afraid than anyone else. But what is fear in the face of the needs of the many? What is fear? Knowing that what I might collect out of my fearfulness will ultimately lead to my unhappiness and disappointment. I've been practicing the Bodhisattva path for some time. I'm afraid of everything. Everything frightens me. I'm a jellyfish by nature. I believe it's my totem. The wild and stealthy jellyfish. But I don't stop, because it doesn't make any sense to stop. Does the Bodhisattva no longer want anything or need anything? No. I want and need everything. Anything you want to give me would be much appreciated. But I do not concern myself with gathering such things. I concern myself with the liberation and salvation of all sentient beings. That's what I concern myself with. I'm not a perfect bodhisattva, but there have been perfect bodhisattvas, and I can tell you that with the understanding that the bodhisattva naturally obtains through this kind of conduct, there is a natural kind of internal ease or lightness of being, a natural kind of quiescence that is a natural byproduct of that kind of lack of emphasis on self-concern and increased emphasis on the well-being of all sentient beings and the reasonableness of accumulating only those virtuous characteristics which can benefit in all future times. There's a reasonableness about that. And as we emphasize that reasonable method and do not emphasize ego cherishing and ego clinging, there is a natural lightness of being that occurs that even while if someone punches us, we will be punched and we will roll over. It isn't so heavy, because as a bodhisattva, although you may experience phenomenal reality in the same way that others do, there is not the suffering of suffering, which only actually occurs when one is filled with desire, just like the Buddha taught, filled with self-cherishing and ego-clinging, filled with hatred, greed, and ignorance. The suffering that comes from that, the deep neuroses of acting inappropriately according to what you actually are, acting like something that is death-oriented, that is contracted, that is separate and limited, as opposed to acting as though you understood that you are that primordial wisdom nature, that grounded being, that Buddha nature, that state of innate wakefulness, that quiescent life. That is the great bodhicitta. That is your nature. If we could act in accordance with that deep neuroses that is characteristic of samsara, that suffering of suffering, could not exist in such a life. And so then, for such a one who practices in that way, all efforts become a benefit to sentient being, no matter what they appear like. Ultimately, they will result in benefit. This is the life of the Bodhisattva, and this is the practice of the Bodhisattva. And this is what each one of us must attain to, because I will tell you, no matter how good you are at sitting in the lotus position, or how good you are at looking like a meditator, or how many of the rules of meditation you know, or how many of the books on spiritual practice you have read and can memorize, if you do not have the bodhicitta, if you are not alive in love, you have no path. If you do not consider others before you, you have no path. Because the path is love.
Julia